Hello, I'm Dan Gibson, and this is another video in the series Archaeology in Islam. As I pointed out earlier in this series of videos, according to my archaeological studies of the earliest mosques, the very first Qibla direction was to face the city of Petra. All of the surviving mosques that I could find from the first 100 years of Islam faced towards the city of Petra in southern Jordan. In this video, we want to start by noticing a change that came when Muawiyah became the first Umayyad Caliph. It may not seem like a great change to us today, but it started something that continued for many centuries. Up until this time, the Caliph was both the religious ruler and the political ruler. Let's illustrate the Caliph like this: religious, political. This is the image that many outsiders have today of religious leaders in Islam, and indeed the very first caliphs who ruled from the city of Medina led the spiritual life of the growing community. However, when Muawiyah became the caliph, a subtle change took place. For many years he held the powerful position of commander of Syria. During this time, he built a large residence in Damascus, from where he managed his section of the Islamic world. Eventually, he was made the caliph, and he continued living in Damascus and set up his court there. At that time, I'm sure it seemed like a natural thing, but it began a substantive shift away from the influences of the three leading religious cities: Mecca, Petra, Medina, and Kufa. By 41 after the Hijrah, the Caliph's court was firmly established in Damascus, but the change was deeper than just a physical change of location. Let me illustrate it this way. Remember, the previous caliphs were large religious, small political, but a change had been made, and this set the pattern for centuries to come. They were first political rulers, then religious. Muawiyah did not display the same piety and the sense of justice that was displayed by the first four caliphs, known as the Rashidun caliphs. Muawiyah's focus was on establishing Islam as a strong political entity. As a result, he put down several major rebellions with shocking violence. Then he set about organizing the Islamic world. As a result, he is the first caliph whose name appears on coins, inscriptions, or documents of the emerging Islamic empire. In order to build his administration, Muawiyah used many Christian bureaucrats, such as Sarjun ibn Mansur, who was head of the tax department. So, I don't think Muawiyah realized how much of a change he was introducing and the reaction that would come from some of the more religious and pious people in the three religious cities. Again, these three holy cities were Medina, Kufa, and the holy cities of Petra, Mecca. These cities were soon hotbeds of rebellion against the Islamic bureaucracy in Damascus. This continued on until Ibn Zubayr, the governor in the Petra, Mecca, was elevated to the role of caliph by the people of the city. Once the people of the city gave their allegiance to Ibn Zubayr as caliph, it became a civil war between the Umayyads in Damascus and Ibn Zubayr in Petra, Mecca. This war lasted 12 long years. In the middle of the war, it appeared that Ibn Zubayr had opportunity to take the Black Rock, which was in his possession, and to move it to some remote place farther away in Saudi Arabia where the Umayyad armies could not easily find it. Well, we're not sure of the exact date. We do know that after this time, the very first mosques were constructed with a Saudi Mecca Qibla. This war went on for several more years. In order to understand the events that followed, it's important to understand the character of one man, General Hajjaj ibn Yūsuf, of the Umayyad armies. He wielded incredible political and military power, and he would leave his mark on Islam forever after this. General al-Hajjaj ibn Yūsuf was born about 41 after the Hijrah near Ta'if. In one of our videos, we identified this with the ruins in Wadi Rum in modern-day Jordan. Ta'if means surrounded, and indeed, the Rum location is surrounded by cliffs on all sides except the open area, which is then walled across the front. And the location has a temple out to the goddess Alat, just like the descriptions of the ancient literature. Now, at the time Hajjaj bin Yūsuf, when he was born, Islam had grown to include Egypt, and during his youth, Islam expanded across North Africa, as well as starting up into Asia. Muawiyah became the Caliph and chose Damascus as his city, and so he also battled with Ali for leadership. So Hajjaj grew up hearing stories of the absolute power of the Caliph. Hajjaj's ancestry was not particularly distinguished. He came from a poor family whose members worked as stonecutters and as builders. As a boy, al-Hajjaj acquired the nickname Kulayb, or Little Dog, the name he would never be able to shake. Now, Hajjaj was a quick learner. He originally became a school teacher in his hometown, which was a source of derision to his enemies who sought to be great warriors, and here he was a school teacher. Soon after, Marwan became the Caliph in 64 AH, and al-Hajjaj, then 24 years old, left his hometown and he went off to the capital, Damascus, where he entered into the security force of the Caliph. There he attracted the attention of Abd al-Malik by his quick and efficient way that he restored discipline during a mutiny of the troops who were appointed to accompany the Caliph on the campaign against Musa'ab ibn Zubair in Iraq. As a result, the Caliph entrusted him with command of the army's rear guard. It was during this time that Abu al-Muhajir Dinar, the Muslim general in North Africa, started having trouble with the caliphs in Damascus. Abu al-Muhajir Dinar, in his anger with Damascus, he was building a mosque, and so he changed the Qibla of his mosque to face south, away from the squabbles in the Middle East, and instead General Dinar placed the new mosque's latrines directly between his mosque and Damascus. Now you can learn about that in the video called Parallel, and that's in the series The Qibla Story. Now, when Ibn Zubair was declared Caliph by the people in the Holy City, Caliph Abdul Malik turned to his most trusted commander, and he sent him to deal with the rebellion. The Caliph commanded Hajjaj to negotiate with Ibn Zubair and to assure him of freedom from punishment if he surrendered. But if the opposition continued, then al-Hajjaj was to starve him out by siege. He was instructed, do not shed blood in Masjid al-Haram. But when the negotiations failed, al-Hajjaj lost his patience. He sent a courier to the Caliph asking for reinforcements and also asking for permission to attack the city by force. He received permission for both of those. So when reinforcements arrived, he started a catapult bombardment as well as direct attacks inside of Masjid al-Haram. The battle between Ibn Zubair and al-Hajjaj took place for 6 months in the center of the city. One witness said he saw the manjanik, that's a trebuchet, throwing stones, and the stones were being hurled. The sky was thundering and lightning, and the sound of the thunder and lightning rose above that of the stones so that it masked it, so there would be thunder and lightning, but these stones would come flying out and smashing on things. The Kaaba with its covering was so damaged that it looked like the torn bosoms of mourning women. The siege lasted for 7 months, and in the end several thousand of Zubair's men had gone over to join Hajjaj, including 2 sons of Ibn Zubair. In the end, Ibn Zubair and his youngest son were killed in the fighting. They were fortified in a ruined building near the Kaaba, and so Hajjaj won the battle over the holy city, which I'm calling Petra/Mecca. But many people were upset with how violent the attack had been, and that blood had been shed in Masjid al-Haram. For its very name, the forbidden masjid, means that the shedding of blood, even animals, was forbidden. Hajjaj then moved on to other cities like Medina and Kufa, who were also in rebellion. As a reward, the Caliph made Hajjaj the governor of the Hejaz and of Yemen and of al-Yamama. Now remember Yamama. It's going to be important to us later. It's located in Saudi Arabia between what I call Petra Mecca in the north and the New Mecca in the south. It was at this time that Hajjaj began to exercise his growing authority. He was keenly aware of a growing rift between the old school Muslims and the emerging powers in Damascus. Hajjaj had several characteristics that made him popular with ruling caliphs. First, he was fiercely loyal. There was never any doubt about who he would support. Would he support the caliph? Absolutely. Second, he was ruthless, and he could be counted on tackling difficult issues. Third, he was very clever when dealing with people. The Umayyad caliphs in Damascus were preoccupied with wars and with rebellions within the empire. As well, there was the expansion of the empire outward. The empire was lacking in administration, so much of the focus of the caliph was on maintaining and creating this infrastructure. The main army was active, marching farther and farther afield. The army not only supported themselves by conquering and looting, and they obtained taxes, and they sent a percentage of the loot plus the taxes back to Damascus. The biggest issue facing the Umayyads was unrest and rebellion at home. Hajjaj proved himself a useful and a loyal commander who could be trusted to put down rebellions, even if they were the old school Muslims who were uncomfortable with what was happening in Damascus. When Hajjaj and his troops marched into Medina, they discovered that the source of much of the unrest came from the old school Muslims who did not agree with the changes that were happening. For instance, when Abu al-Muhajjid Dinar started out his African Qibla, really no one challenged him. Since he was replaced by General Uqba bin Nafi of the Quraysh, but even Uqba's tomb and the new mosques in North Africa used the new Qibla. So when the companions of the prophets, that's the old school, those who were with Muhammad in the early days, when they spoke out, Hajjaj made them an object of derision. Listen to what Tabari tells us. In this year, Hajjaj went back to Medina. In the month of Safar, that's July and August, they stayed there 3 months, treating the people harshly and arbitrarily. Hajjaj built a mosque there in the area of the Banu Salama, which is still known by his name. Now, that's when al-Tabari was talking. As far as I know, that mosque no longer exists. Back to al-Tabari. He, Hajjaj, treated the companions of the messengers of God with contempt, forcing them to wear heavy seals around their necks. According to Muhammad bin Umar ibn Abi Dhib, someone saw Jabir bin Abdullah with a seal on his hand. According to Ibn Abi Dhib, Isbaq ibn Yazid saw Anas bin Malik with a seal around his neck. Al-Hajjaj did that to humiliate him. Now I'm still quoting al-Tabari. According to Ibn Umar, Shurabil ibn Abi Awan, his father, I was there when Al-Hajjaj sent for Sahab ibn Sa'ad and asked him, what was it that prevented you from supporting the commander of the faithful, Uthman bin Affan? He replied, but I did. Al-Hajjaj said, "You're lying." Then he ordered a lead seal to be put on his neck. Now, Belladuri tells us that during the placing of the seals, this type of seals, this was an indication of dhimma, which indicated the requirement for paying taxes among dhimmis. These are the people who were subjugated by Islam. This humiliating persecution continued on for several years. Do you see what was happening? Hajjaj was using his powerful position to reduce the influence of those Muslims who were of the old school. Those were the Muslims who had been with Muhammad. Think about it. Many of the old school were soldiers, and they'd gone off to the far ends of the Islamic empire to fight, and many of them had died there, some of them had stayed out there. So the number of the companions of the prophets was diminishing. But at home, new ideas, new thoughts, new practices were emerging. Hajjaj was instrumental in silencing the old school, even to dealing harshly with the companions of the Prophet. According to Ibn Abd Ribah, Al-Hajjaj's he continued abuse of Anas, even some 2 years later in al-Basra, and it prompted the latter to write a letter of complaint to Caliph Abdul Malik, who then convinced Hajjaj to apologize. Now we'll come back to Anas at the end of this video. Now during his lifetime, Al-Hajjaj persecuted the companions of the Prophet, and eventually he actually put to death 4 Sahaba, or companions of Muhammad. Al-Hajjaj also tortured and killed the dearest and closest companions of Ali, such as Humayl and Qanbar and Sa'id, just to name a few, but a few of the many hundreds of his victims. Al-Hajjaj was extremely capable and ruthless. He was a statesman, but he was very strict in character and also harsh and demanding. He was widely feared by his contemporaries, and he became a deeply controversial figure later, as later writers wrote. And later he was an object of deep-seated enmity, as sometimes he did things different than even what the caliphs themselves desired. Hajjaj did not always need a reason to put people to death. He would select some small thing and use it against them. Al-Tabari tells us of how Al-Hajjaj waited until Humayl came to collect his ata, that's his pension. Al-Hajjaj seized him and said to him, "Are you the one of those who treated Caliph Uthman in such a poor manner?" And he said other things as well against him. Humayl retorted, "Do not put such blame on me, and do not pour a mountain of sand on me. It was only that the man had slapped me when then asked me to be patient, and I forgave him. So which one of us was the evil one?" Then Al-Hajjaj gave the order, and Humayl was put to death. In 75 after the Hijrah, Caliph Abdul Malik needed a strong supporter and an ally that he could trust, so he appointed Al-Hajjaj as governor of Iraq. This placed Hajjaj in a very powerful positioning, governing now the entire eastern half of the Caliphate. The following years were filled with bloody wars, putting down rebellions, and ruling with an iron fist. Hajjaj even managed to arrange marriages between his family and the Caliph's family. What interests us the most is the construction of the city of Wasit, starting around the year 83 after the Hijrah. A number of interesting mosque constructions and renovations took place during this time. As archaeological evidence now shows us, the Qibla of the mosques being built in the Islamic world, they did not all agree. The first striking evidence is that Al-Hajjaj's mosque in Wasit faced a spot directly between Mecca and Petra. This is the meaning of the word Wasit. It means between. What was it between? It was between the Qibla of Petra Mecca in the north and the emerging Qibla of the new Mecca down in Saudi Arabia. So during that time, when the time that Hajjaj was in power, other important mosques were then being built. Damascus, Basra, the desert palaces, the mosque in Haran, and even the main mosque in the city of Raqqa in Syria were all constructed facing this between position. I've counted some 20 mosques, some of them major mosques, that were built under Hajjaj's time in leadership, and they all faced towards a place in Saudi Arabia between Petra and Mecca. Now look here at the Congregational Mosque in Yamamah. What makes this mosque special is that Yamamah is north of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, and it is south of Petra. And yet the Qibla of this mosque faces north, away from Mecca, towards the between position. Now why would Hajjaj pick such a strange Qibla? If you think about it, al-Hajjaj would have disdained the original city. Since he'd fought against it, he had destroyed it, smashing down the old temples, destroying the original Kaaba. I am sure that he was upset with the black rock that was moved down to Saudi Arabia, and those he considered as rebels down there. He did not accept their Kaaba. And while some Muslims were embracing this new location, saying it was Masjid al-Haram, al-Hajjaj chose his own Qibla, halfway between the two. Perhaps pride had something to do with it. Hajjaj had the power to do this, and he could threaten and even kill anybody who opposed him. Later, after his death, he was criticized for this, and he brought criticism down on Caliph Walid, who allowed it to happen. Later writers, such as Jahiz, included the setting of the Qibla of Wasit among the misdeeds of the Caliph, as it began a dangerous precedent. So how did al-Hajjaj convince the Caliph to let him pick his own Qibla? Well, al-Hajjaj had an inside track. As we said, his daughter became the wife of Mansur, who was the son of the Caliph. What is astounding is that so many of the later mosques built under the Umayyads faced this between position. So far, I've found over 20 different mosques facing the between position. But remember, at the very same time, there were mosques being built still facing the old Petra Mecca, and there were some new mosques being built facing Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So, why did some people accept Hajjaj's new between Qibla? Well, first, it was because of the power that Hajjaj wielded, and because of the terror that he caused among people. Now, for example, this story has come down to us from al-Tabri. A man known to us as al-Hassan went to see Hajjaj. Hajjaj asked al-Hassan why he was always so disrespectful towards him. He, Hajjaj, was the ruler, but Hassan was disrespectful, but he was also influential in giving legal opinions in the mosque. Hassan replied that he could only say what God had said. Hajjaj challenged him, and so what does God say? Hassan took the opportunity to challenge Hajjaj on the topic of his Qibla. Hassan said, "We appointed the Qibla which you have been observing only that we might know those who would follow the messenger from those who would turn on their heels, although it was a big thing, except to those whom Allah guided." Hassan then added, "Also Ali was of those directed by God to the right way." Now we can see this from Ali's tomb, which was facing Petra. Then Hajjaj raged, and he bent down, striking the ground. Hassan then got up and left. He fled, and no one stood in his way. Then he went into hiding until Hajjaj died. Notice the topic that Hassan chose when confronting Hajjaj. It was his Qibla. This is an example of the political rulers with their military might and their spies and their intrigue. They are opposing the old school, the old religious teachers. Later, when he was safe, al-Hassan said this, "I just came from a little squinting man, a short person, pointing at me with his short fingers that rarely knew the reins of holy war. By God, even though they ride non-Arabian horses and climb the pulpits, The dishonor of sin is a pendant from their necks. God refuses to do anything but disgrace those who disobey him. He will not cease to teach them lessons and to use them as examples for the believers. O God, kill him as he killed your sunnah. What does he mean by sunnah? The customs and the practices of the Prophet Muhammad. Here Hassan claims that Hajjaj had even changed the sunnah, or the customs and practices of the Prophet Muhammad. When people ask me how the Muslim world would stand by while the Qibla was changed, I realize that they don't know the history of Islam very well, and they don't understand the power and the influence wielded by the likes of Hajjaj. One by one, the Muslims of the old school were silenced or eliminated. Remember, this is only 80 years after the founding of Islam. The Muslim presence, though, is spread very thinly over the Islamic world. The vast majority of the original Muslims are spread all across the empire. Many men are in far-off armies, North Africa or over in Asia. The bulk of Muslims at this time are new converts into Islam. And many others are just observers. They're under the dhimmi, under the influence of the rulers there. And so the power and the influence of the Caliph is very powerful. Thousands of Ibn Zubair's followers in the Holy City had deserted him and had joined al-Hajjaj. Ta'if was under the thumb of al-Hajjaj. Medina had been subjected by al-Hajjaj. Kufa was in al-Hajjaj's hands. The Caliph, he was over in Damascus, so who would dare object? People tend to follow their leaders, and since the new leaders were supporting these changes in Islam, they were followed. When Hajjaj died, though, the between Qibla ceased to be practiced, and Mecca in Saudi Arabia became the principal Qibla, supported by the Caliphs from then on. As I read and reread Islamic history, there's no doubt in my mind that the Caliph and his governors completely controlled and dominated Islam at this time. Anyone opposing their views was suppressed and silenced under the threat of death. The companions of the Prophet, they were systematically singled out and silenced. Many were put to death. Let me close this with some stories. We'll do a story about Anas. We mentioned him earlier. In this account, he's sitting in a mosque in Damascus. Well, most of the men who started out with Muhammad had long since died in battle. He remembered back to the early days, back to the time of the Prophet. He remembered a different Islam was practiced in Arabia. So, Bukhari recounts two hadiths, narrated by Ghilan. Anas said, I do not find things as they were in the time of the Prophet. Somebody said, well, the prayer is as it was. Anas said, have you not also done to the prayer what you have done to everything else? Another hadith narrated by Zuhri, when he visited Anas bin Malik at Damascus, he found him weeping. And he asked him why he was weeping. He replied, I do not know anything which I used to know during the lifetime of Allah's apostle, except for this prayer, which is being lost. And one last account from Tabri. During the height of Hajjaj's reign of terror, Caliph Walid visited Medina. During his time, he spotted Sa'id bin al-Musayyib. And here is what al-Tabri tells us the story. Walid then advanced until he stood before Sa'id. He said, how are you, O Sheikh? Sa'id neither moved nor stood. And then he said, well, praise be to Allah, and how is the commander of the faithful? Al-Walid said, well, alhamdulillah. And then Walid departed. Later he said to Umar, he, referring to Sa'id, is the last of the old school. Now you see, everyone else had been silenced or eliminated. Now there was a full acceptance of the changes brought about by the reformers. Damascus was the ruling city. Petra, Mecca, was in ruins. The holy city of Mecca was the new, pristine location in Saudi Arabia. It was only a religious pilgrimage city with no political clout. The Muslims had accepted this because there were no temples, there were no idols, there were no churches, there were no Christians, none of this in Mecca. There weren't even any Jews. And so it was a truly Islamic city and had no trace of outside influence. So you ask me, how could the Muslims accept the change of Qibla? My answer is simply, read Islamic history. Hajjaj ibn Yūsuf was a tool in the hands of the caliphs to subdue and silence any objections to their efforts to solidify the Muslim empire and form it into one cohesive religion with Mecca in Saudi Arabia as the universal Qibla. And so, that was the end of it. Or was it? You see, whenever you try to silence people by force, what they know goes underground. And that is what happened in Islam. There were some people who still knew something about the old days, and they told it to their children, and they told it to their children, and it eventually resurfaced. But that is the subject of another video. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology and Islam.